Do1 is between the tip of the coccyx and the anus.
Do2 is located on the posterior midline in the sacral coccygeal hiatus. To find this point, palpate down the sacrum, feeling for the cleft in between the sacrum and the coccyx. In this case, it's quite high. In some cases, you'll find this cleft will actually be inside the gluteal fold.
Do3 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of L4. Do4 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of L2. Do5 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of L1. Do6 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of T11. Do7 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of T10. Do8 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of T9. Do9 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of T7. Do10 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of T6. Do11 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of T5. Do12 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of T3. Do13 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of T1. Do14 is on the posterior midline, below the spinous process of C7 in a depression.
Do15 is located half a cun inferior to Do16. It's on the posterior midline, about halfway between Do16 and the posterior hairline. Be sure to mark this point directly on the posterior midline. Do16 is located on the posterior midline at the base of the occiput. To find the base of the occiput, palpate down to about 1 cun superior to the posterior hairline. If you rock the head backwards and forwards very gently, you should be able to feel the cleft between the base of the occiput and the spine. Make sure you mark this point directly on the posterior midline. Do17 is on the posterior midline. It's 1/4 of the distance between Do16 and Do20. Do17 is 1.5 cun superior to Do16, but more importantly, it's in a nice depression at the superior border of the external occipital protuberance. Do18 is on the posterior midline, halfway between Do20 and Do16. Do19 is on the posterior midline, 1.5 cun posterior to Do20, which places it at the junction of the upper quarter and lower 3/4 of a line joining Do16 to Do20. Do20 is located in relation to the midpoint between the glabella and the occiput. Place the heel of your palm on the glabella and the occiput. Fold your fingers around the skull to find the midpoint. Do20 is located 1 cun posterior to that midpoint. It typically lies in a nice dip. There are several other nice dips slightly further back, which are other dew points, so don't be tempted to go further back than 1 cun posterior to that midpoint. Do21 is located on the midline, 3.5 cun posterior to the anterior hairline and 1.5 cun anterior to Do20. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cun for Do20. 1, 2, 3 and a half for Do21. Do22 is located on the midline, 2 cun posterior to the anterior hairline. Use the 3 cun from the centre of the glabella to the anterior hairline to calculate the 2 cun that you need to find Do22. Do23 is located on the anterior midline, 1 cun posterior to the anterior hairline. We take the distance between the centre of the glabella and the anterior hairline as being 3 cun. So divide this into 3 to get your 1 cun to move back to locate Do23. Do24 is located on the anterior midline, midway between Do23 and the anterior hairline. Do25 is on the anterior midline at the very tip of the nose. Do26 is on the anterior midline at the junction of the upper third and lower 2/3 of the philtrum. Do27 is on the anterior midline at the junction of the philtrum and the upper margin of the lip. Do28 is located inside the mouth at the upper frenulum, at the junction of the upper gums and the lip.